Hey everybody, Marcus here. The concept of NAWALT, or not all women are like that, has been acknowledged as a common argument used by detractors of MGTOW ideas. Though this is not really an argument in the strictest sense of the word, we can rephrase the acronym of NAWALT to read like an argument. It would go something as follows. 1. MGTOW assert that all women possess certain qualities and certain behaviors. 2. Counterexamples exist of women who do not possess these certain qualities and certain behaviors. The conclusion, therefore, not all women are like what MGTOW describe. There have been several arguments made in an attempt to refute the NAWALT argument. What I've recently encountered, however, is a disturbing trend among MGTOW in acknowledging the technical correctness of the NAWALT argument, but then pushing forward and still claiming that the NAWALT argument does not hold true for some large segment of women. Therefore, the NAWALT argument cannot be used when arguing against MGTOW claims. Okay, this is unsound reasoning. If the NAWALT argument is acknowledged to be technically correct, then it is acknowledged to be a sound argument. As such, the NAWALT argument necessarily must be accepted as true unless refuted. This is how logic functions and cannot be circumvented for convenience. This means that to both acknowledge NAWALT as a sound argument and still hold that it is not true in some rationalization hamster way is to be in contradiction. I don't like seeing MGTOW making contradictory claims. As such, in this video, I will attempt my own refutation of the NAWALT argument. First, we must distinguish between deductive and inductive arguments. A deductive argument operates on concepts alone and does not reference experience in its premises. An example of a deductive argument is as follows. All men are mortal. Marcus is a man. Therefore, Marcus is mortal. This argument is a valid argument because I can deduce the conclusion from the two premises without having to go into the world and check anything. The argument may also be sound if the premises hold true. However, the premises do not need to be true for the argument to be valid. The premises need to be true, however, for the argument to be true. The difference between a valid and sound argument, for those who are not familiar with this terminology, are as follows. An argument is considered valid if the conclusion follows from the premises. In our example, the conclusion that Marcus is mortal necessarily follows from the premises we have used, namely, all men are mortal and Marcus is a man. Now, an argument is considered sound if the argument is valid and if the premises are true. So, our deductive argument has been shown to be valid, and it can be shown to be sound if indeed it can be shown that all men are mortal and if it can be shown that Marcus is a man. A sound deductive argument is the strongest possible argument that can possibly be made. Now, let us look at an example of an inductive argument. The sun has risen in the east every day, therefore the sun will rise in the east tomorrow. As you can see, the premise in this argument is contingent on some recurring pattern observed empirically, which allows for a general conclusion to be drawn with a high level of certainty, but not with absolute certainty like in a deductive argument. Inductive arguments hinge on the assertion that the future will reflect the past. Of course, this is an unprovable assertion, which is also commonly referred to as the problem of induction. But for our intents and purposes, we do not need to worry ourselves about the problem of induction. Now, let us look at the NAWALT argument. Is this a deductive argument? Well, yes it is. This is important because you cannot defeat a deductive argument with an inductive argument. This is why we see MGTOW struggling in defeating the NAWALT argument and conceding that it is technically true. From an inductive perspective, absolute statements cannot be made because induction does not have such explanatory force. But what do we mean when we say it is technically true? Well, the NAWALT argument, as we have presented it earlier, looks like a valid deductive argument. It also looks sound. This is what we mean when we say technically true. In order to defeat the NAWALT argument, you must do one of two things. You must either demonstrate that the argument is invalid or show that one of the premises is false. Let us look at the premises of the NAWALT argument one more time. 1. MGTOW assert that all women possess certain qualities and certain behaviors. 2. Counterexamples exist of women who do not possess these certain qualities and certain behaviors. Therefore, not all women are like what MGTOW describe. Now, from first glance, I get the impression that this argument is valid but not sound. As such, my strategy will be to tear down the NAWALT argument by finding that premise 2 is false, which will make the NAWALT argument false. This means that I will show deductively that counterexamples of women exist who do not possess these universal qualities or behaviors is a false statement. It is important that you keep in mind that I am making a deductive argument here because deductive arguments have absolute 100% certainty if shown to be sound. Now, let's see if the strategy pays off for me. First, however, we need to clarify what we mean in the first premise. What does it mean to say that MGTOW assert that all women possess certain qualities and certain behaviors? Well, let us simplify this statement a little. Let us change the wording to say, all women possess certain qualities and certain behaviors. At face value, this is a true statement. For example, all women eat and sleep, and they all possess qualities such as age and height. But we want to make this a deductive argument through and through, so let's stick to purely concepts. The sentence, all women possess certain qualities and certain behaviors, has the subject concept woman and the predicate concept certain qualities and certain behaviors. As a whole, this sentence is an affirmative subject-predicate judgment. If you're not familiar with the term affirmative subject-predicate judgment, then please watch my MGTOW counts semantics video in which I explore these themes in great depth. Now, the predicate concept, certain qualities and certain behaviors, is very vague and ambiguous. Perhaps we should elaborate. Well, by certain qualities and certain behaviors, we mean those qualities and behaviors by which the subject concept woman can be understood. What are those qualities and behaviors? Well, it doesn't matter. We are not here to investigate the form of the woman. We are only stating that for the term woman to be a meaning-bearing label, it must possess some form. So with this said, we can simplify premise 1 of the NAWALT argument even further, so it reads, all women participate in the form of woman. Now, we can clearly see that this affirmative subject-predicate judgment has now become an analytic a priori affirmative subject-predicate judgment. This is justified by Aristotle's first law of logic, the law of identity, which states that a thing is identical with itself if it exists. This means that certain qualities and certain behaviors is contained in the subject concept woman. In fact, these qualities and behaviors are that by which we can even distinguish a woman from a tree or a toaster. We know this statement to be analytic because the predicate concept form is contained in the subject concept woman, and we know this a priori without the need of experience because it is the very essence we are referring to and not a particular woman. But don't take my word for it. Listen to what Aristotle says in Book 4 of the Metaphysics as far as the law of identity is concerned. First then, this at least is obviously true, that the word be or not be has a definite meaning, so that not everything will be so and not so. Again, if man has one meaning, let this be two-footed animal. By having one meaning, it understands this. If man means X, then if A is a man, X will be what being a man means for him. It makes no difference even if one were to say a word has several meanings, if only they are limited in number, for to each definition there might be assigned a different word. For instance, we might say that man has not one meaning but several, one of which would have one definition with respect to two-footed animal, while there might be also several other definitions if only they were limited in number, for a particular name might be assigned to each of the definitions. If, however, they were not limited, but one were to say that the word has an infinite number of meanings, obviously reasoning would be impossible. For not to have one meaning is to have no meaning, and if words have no meaning, our reasoning with one another, and indeed with ourselves, has been annihilated. For it is impossible to think of anything if we do not think of one thing. But if this is possible, one name might be assigned to this thing. Now, let us look at premise 2 of the NAWALT argument. Premise 2 we stated as follows. Counterexamples exist of women who do not possess these certain qualities and certain behaviors. If we take what we have said previously and rephrase this premise under our new understanding, premise 2 will read as follows. Women exist who do not participate in the form of woman. Now, let us put back together the NAWALT argument and see what has happened. Premise 1 is now, all women participate in the form of woman. Premise 2 is now, women exist who do not participate in the form of woman. And the conclusion stays the same. Therefore, not all women are like what MGTOW described. Well. Look what has happened. We embarked on the strategy of attempting to show that premise 2 was false. But what ended up happening is that we showed that premise 2 is false, and also that the NAWALT argument is in fact invalid, as now we see that premise 1 and premise 2 are contradictory. This means that the NAWALT argument, when evaluated as a deductive argument, is internally contradictory, therefore false right out the gate. In fact, something a lot more interesting has happened here than us merely disproving this version of the NAWALT argument. What has happened is that we have demonstrated that there is no version of the NAWALT argument that can actually be non-contradictory metaphysically. Now let me explain. By asserting the ontological obtainment of woman, we have committed ourselves to Aristotle's law of identity, which means that premise 1, all women participate in the form of woman, is necessarily true. Since there is no way to get around this premise, any statement attempting to say that some women do not meet this criteria will immediately be contradictory, therefore cannot act as a premise in a NAWALT argument. As such, the NAWALT argument is not possible in this way. But you might be thinking to yourself, Marcus, you said that we asserted that women obtain ontologically. What if we reject this assumption and assert that there is no such thing as a woman? Now, this is not to be understood as stating that there are no humans with vaginas walking around, but that the very concept of woman does not exist. Some feminists have done this. One form of this idea is the theory of the social construction of the concept of woman. Okay, let us go with this and assert that the concept woman does not exist. If indeed this is the case, then too the NAWALT argument cannot be made, because you cannot make any claim about the non-existent. Nothing can be known of that which does not exist. It is epistemologically impossible. As such, to even make a NAWALT argument, you must assert that women ontologically obtain. Otherwise, you are immediately in contradiction with yourself. So, we have now demonstrated that not only is the NAWALT argument false due to internal contradiction, but we have also shown that there is no possible world in which a NAWALT argument can be valid, as it is invalid in both cases where women ontologically obtain and in the case that women do not ontologically obtain. So, not only is it false to say that not all women are like that, but in fact you must say the reverse, and with gusto. Necessarily all women are like that. In fact, women are like that in all possible worlds. Isn't metaphysics fun? Okay. But you might be thinking to yourself, but Marcus, not all women will divorce their husbands and fleece them of their money. Not all women will alienate the father from his children, and so on. How do you account for all of this? Well, very good question. To answer this, we must understand what has transpired up to this point. You see, the NAWALT argument has a more generic shape to it. Up to this point, we have been attempting to answer the generic question of whether or not all women are like that. Now, we have deduced the conclusion that indeed they are all like that, but what we have not done is answer in any meaningful way what that is. You see, though we have deductively shown that all women necessarily participate in the form of woman, we have in no way shown what the form of woman actually is. And this is the direction we would need to go in order to account for the exceptions you have listed. However, we are now moving away from the question of whether or not all women are like that, and moving toward the question of what is woman? Namely, what is the form of woman that all women participate in? This is a very different question, and the answer to this question was in no way necessary to defeat the NAWALT argument. You see, we use the hypothetical method of inquiry in order to answer the whether or not question. In order to answer the what is it or what is woman question, we would need to switch to dialectic. The answer to the question of what is woman, well, it's outside the scope of this video. What is important to note is that up to this point, MGTOW have attempted to argue against a deductive NAWALT argument that seemed both valid and sound, and they would try to argue with inductive counter-arguments. You would see MGTOW make statements like, well, Even if not all of them are like that, most of them are, and so it's not worth looking for the unicorns. Do you see how such a statement concedes defeat? How this statement acknowledges that in an absolute sense, some women are not like that, but inductively, there are very few of them? This strategy was doomed to fail from the start because deductive arguments trump inductive arguments. Well, what we needed to do first, is defeat the deductive NAWALT argument so that we can remove this uncertainty as to the ontological possibility of NAWALT. The conclusion is that NAWALT do not exist, and it is impossible for them to exist in all possible worlds. We showed that the deductive NAWALT argument was neither valid nor sound when faced with metaphysical scrutiny. The next stage of battling the NAWALT argument is to tackle the inductive NAWALT argument. Now, I'm very generous here when I even refer to it as a NAWALT argument, because it really is not a NAWALT argument at all. It is really an argument concerned with the question of what is woman, namely, what is the form of woman. However, I will refer to it as the inductive NAWALT argument because I believe this is the version of the NAWALT argument that most people imagine when they bring up NAWALT. The inductive NAWALT argument will go something as follows. 1. MGTOW assert that all women are hypergamous, gynocentric, have in-group bias, and so forth. 2. Counterexamples exist of women who are not hypergamous, not gynocentric, do not have in-group bias, and so forth. Therefore, not all women are like what MGTOW describe. Notice how in the inductive NAWALT argument, we are concerned with individual qualities and not with women as a unity. The inductive argument is a little more interesting than the deductive one and will demand more delicacy in dealing with it. I will attempt to tackle this inductive argument in the next video in this series. For this video, however, remember that we have proven that NAWALT are impossible in all possible worlds, which is no small victory in its own right. So the next time you hear somebody call out NAWALT, agree with them. Say, yes, you are correct. Necessarily all women are like that. Thanks for listening. Go team.